Good morning, YouTube people. I promised to make this video for an owner who's doing a carb conversion and has run into a situation. This little camera takes AVI files that are absolutely humongous. I mean, they're like 500 megabytes to a gig. Just way, way, way too big to attach to an email. And I lost my FLV conversion software. When my computer had its mental breakdown and I had to put it all back together, I lost my FLV conversion software, and I haven't found any conversion software I like nearly as much. So what I've been doing is I've just been uploading these AVIs to YouTube and letting YouTube do the FLV conversion as part of the upload process. And then I can either re-download the video as an FLV, or what I've been doing is I've just been leaving it on YouTube, kind of like cloud storage, and just hyperlinking to the YouTube URL. So that's what I'm going to do for this guy. And some of you all may have run into a similar situation, so some of this information may be useful to somebody else, and if not, you can just eavesdrop on our private conversation. But anyway, the situation he's run into, he's going to be repurposing his old KJet return line as a front to rear fuel line, which is a perfectly fine idea. I mean, that's really the best way of getting fuel from the front of the car to the rear of the car. I mean, that's what I do on my own car. But the situation he's run into is his factory original fitting has been cut off of that line. All he has is just a piece of bare tubing. So I'm going to show him. Farrah had the same situation here on this car. So I'm going to show him how I fixed it on Farrah's car. And but before I do that, this is what originally came from the factory. These fittings came off my Volvo, but they're identical to what was originally on DeLoreans from Dunmurry. You had a barbed fitting. This is what your fluoroelastometric tubing that came from the fuel distributor was heat shrunk onto. And this fitting has a flared end on it. The tubing runs from front to rear of the car, has a flared end that butts up against that, and then you have a flare nut that fits over the tubing and locks everything together. So that is what originally came from the factory. And if you still have the factory configuration and you're doing a carb conversion, all you have to do is put a piece of 1/4-inch hose over these barbs, put a hose clamp on it, run it to your mechanical fuel pump, boom, done. Now on Farrah's car, what he ran into was his tubing was cut off. This fitting was cut off. So I used a compression fitting. This here is a compression fitting. And the way these compression fittings work, you've got the nut. This goes on the tubing first. And you've got a ferrule that slides on the tubing. And then you got the remainder of the compression fitting that squeezes everything together and gives you a tight connection on your tubing. And once you've done that, you can then put a hose barb onto your compression fitting, and you now have a recreation of what was originally on the car from the factory. Put your 1/4-inch fuel line over the barbs, put a hose clamp on it, run it to your fuel pump, boom, done. Now, before I show you Farrah's car here, let me just say a word real quick about these compression fittings. Okay, these compression fittings are rated for 1,200 psi. Look it up. And that's the brass ones. I think the steel ones are rated even higher. But a brass compression fitting, 5/16 compression fitting, is rated for 1,200 psi. Now, over the years, I have seen KJetters just tie themselves into knots over their factory original fittings, usually around the fuel filter or the accumulator. And I think what happens, this is also off my Volvo, but as you can see, this fitting rusted to the tubing. That's the old tubing, rusted to the flare nut. These flare fittings rust like nobody's business. They're made out of god-awful steel. It's soft, it rusts, it'll rust to the tubing, the fittings will rust together. The only way you can get them apart is to put heat on them. But of course, as soon as you put heat on them, you ruin the fluid that's inside of them. So, I mean, I hate these steel flare fittings. All I use is brass. I'm a total brass snob. So if you're one of these KJetters who's tied yourself in the knots because you got god-awful rusty steel fittings on your fuel lines, my recommendation is to cut them off and replace them with brass. Alright? Your fuel system does not have 1,200 psi in it. It has 75 psi, a fraction of what this fitting is rated for. If you install it correctly, you will never even come close to that fitting's rated capacity. So that's my recommendation. And this is Farrer's fuel line. Like I told you, this line here is going to the front of the car, and it was just cut off. It was just, steel tubing cut off. So here's his compression nut. There's the compression fitting, and sandwiched between the two of them is the ferrule. Use 2 wrenches to turn the 2 pieces of the fitting together, tighten everything up. You now have a 1,200 psi rated connection on your tubing. And then his barb is underneath here. The barbed part of it is underneath this hose clamp, and then that's the hex that you turn to get onto the fitting. So Farrer now has a brass recreation of what was originally on his fuel line. And then this rubber hose just runs up and around to his mechanical fuel pump. There's his mechanical fuel pump. So the owner who's doing the car conversion that just has the bare tubing, my recommendation is put a compression fitting on the bare tubing, put a barb onto the compression fitting, put the hose, the clamp, run it to the mechanical pump, boom, done. And like I said, all I use is brass. I'm a total brass snob. And in fact, this is fun. I don't know if y'all can see down there. That is Farrer's vacuum line that goes to his brake booster. Now, from the factory, the barb came straight towards the rear of the car. But really, what I needed was a 90-degree bend. It just works better to put a 90-degree bend in it and run it over across the back of the car to his T. This is the T where the brake booster and HVAC lines separate. Brass, of course. All I use is brass. So I cut off his factory fitting, put a compression fitting on there, a 90-degree barb, and now his tubing, runs straight across the back of the car, rather than making a wicked bend from the barb that was originally pointed towards the rear of the car. So those compression fittings can come in real handy, and so that's what I'm recommending that owner who's got just the cut tubing do. I also recommend all you KJetters do it. Watch this space.